Book I, Section 28 of Tusculan Disputations by Cicero, translated by Charles Duke Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. 28. Of this kind and nature is the intellect of man. Where then is this intellect seated, and of what character is it? Where is your own, and what is its character? Are you able to tell? If I have not faculties for knowing all that I could desire to know, will you not even allow me to make use of those which I have? The soul has not sufficient capacity to comprehend itself, yet the soul, like the eye, though it has no distinct view of itself, sees other things. It does not see, which is of least consequence, its own shape; perhaps not, though it possibly may. But we will pass that by. But it certainly sees that it has vigor, sagacity, memory, motion, and velocity. These are all great, divine, eternal properties. What its appearance is, or where it dwells, it is not necessary even to inquire; as when we behold, first of all, the beauty and brilliant appearance of the heavens; secondly, the vast velocity of its revolutions, beyond power of our imagination to conceive; then the vicissitudes of nights and days; the fourfold division of the seasons, so well adapted to the ripening of the fruits of the earth, and the temperature of our bodies; and, after that, we look up to the sun, the moderator and governor of all these things, and view the moon by the increase and decrease of its light, marking, as it were, and appointing our holy days; and see the 5 planets, borne on in the same circle, divided into 12 parts, preserving the same course with the greatest regularity, but with utterly dissimilar motions among themselves; and the nightly appearance of the heaven, adorned on all sides with stars; then the globe of the earth, raised above the sea, and placed in the centre of the universe, inhabited and cultivated in its 2 opposite extremities, one of which, the place of our habitation, is situated towards the North Pole, under the 7 stars, where the cold northern blasts, with horrid sound, harden to ice the snowy covered ground. The other, towards the South Pole, is unknown to us, but is called by the Greeks Antichthona. The other parts are uncultivated, because they are either frozen with cold, or burned up with heat; but where we dwell it never fails in its season to yield a placid sky, to bid the trees assume the lively verdure of their leaves, the vine to bud, and, joyful in its shoots, foretell the approaching vintage of its fruits; the ripened corn to sing, while all around full rivulets glide, and flowers deck the ground. Then the multitude of cattle, fit part for food, part for tilling the ground, others for carrying us, or for clothing us; and man himself, made as it were on purpose to contemplate the heavens and the Gods, and to pay adoration to them; lastly, the whole earth, and wide extending seas, given to man's use. When we view these, and numberless other things, can we doubt that they have some being who presides over them, or has made them, if indeed they have been made, as is the opinion of Plato, or if, as Aristotle thinks, they are eternal; or who at all events is the regulator of so immense a fabric and so great a blessing to men? Thus, though you see not the soul of man, as you see not the Deity, yet, as by the contemplation of his works you are led to acknowledge a God, so you must own the divine power of the soul from its remembering things, from its invention, from the quickness of its motion, and from all the beauty of virtue. Where, then, is it seated, you will say? XXIX. In my opinion, it is seated in the head, and I can bring you reasons for my adopting that opinion. At present let the soul reside where it will; you certainly have one in you. Should you ask what its nature is? It has one peculiarly its own, but admitting it to consist of fire or air, it does not affect the present question. Only observe this, that as you are convinced there is a God, though you are ignorant where he resides, and what shape he is of, in like manner you ought to feel assured that you have a soul, though you cannot satisfy yourself of the place of its residence, nor its form. In our knowledge of the soul, unless we are grossly ignorant of natural philosophy, we cannot but be satisfied that it has nothing but what is simple, unmixed, uncompounded, and single; and if this is admitted, then it cannot be separated, nor divided, nor dispersed, nor parted, and therefore it cannot perish; for to perish implies a parting asunder, a division, a disunion of those parts which, while it subsisted, were held together by some band. And it was because he was influenced by these and similar reasons that Socrates neither looked out for anybody to plead for him when he was accused, nor begged any favor from his judges, but maintained a manly freedom, which was the effect not of pride, but of the true greatness of his soul. And on the last day of his life he held a long discourse on this subject; and a few days before, when he might have been easily freed from his confinement, he refused to be so; and when he had almost actually hold of that deadly cup, he spoke with the air of a man not forced to die, but ascending into heaven. XXX. For so indeed he thought himself, and thus he spoke: that there were two ways, and that the souls of men, at their departure from the body, took different roads; for those which were polluted with vices, that are common to men, and which had given themselves up entirely to unclean desires, and had become so blinded by them as to have habituated themselves to all manner of debauchery and profligacy, or to have laid detestable schemes for the ruin of their country, took a road wide of that which led to the assembly of the Gods. But they who had preserved themselves upright and chaste, and free from the slightest contagion of the body, and had always kept themselves as far as possible at a distance from it, and, while on earth, had proposed to themselves as a model the life of the Gods, found the return to those beings from whom they had come an easy one. Therefore he argues that all good and wise men should take example from the swans, who are considered sacred to Apollo, not without reason, but particularly because they seem to have received the gift of divination from him, by which, foreseeing how happy it is to die, they leave this world with singing and joy. Nor can any one doubt of this, unless it happens to us who think with care and anxiety about the soul, as is often the case with those who look earnestly at the setting sun, to lose the sight of it entirely; and so the mind's eye, viewing itself, sometimes grows dull, and for that reason we become remiss in our contemplation. Thus our reasoning is borne about, harassed with doubts and anxieties, not knowing how to proceed, but measuring back again those dangerous tracks which it has passed, like a boat tossed about on the boundless ocean. But these reflections are of long standing, and borrowed from the Greeks. But Cato left this world in such a manner as if he were delighted that he had found an opportunity of dying; for that God who presides in us forbids our departure hence without his leave. But when God himself has given us a just cause, as formerly he did to Socrates, and lately to Cato, and often to many others, in such a case, certainly every man of sense would gladly exchange this darkness for that light. Not that he would forcibly break from the chains that held him, for that would be against the law; but like a man released from prison by a magistrate, or some lawful authority, so he too would walk away, being released and discharged by God. For the whole life of a philosopher is, as the same philosopher says, a meditation on death. XXXI. For what else is it that we do when we call off our minds from pleasure, that is to say, from our attention to the body, from the managing our domestic estate, which is a sort of handmaid and servant of the body, or from duties of a public nature, or from all other serious business whatever. What else is it, I say, that we do but invite the soul to reflect on itself, oblige it to converse with itself, and, as far as possible, break off its acquaintance with the body? Now, to separate the soul from the body is to learn to die, and nothing else whatever. Wherefore, take my advice, and let us meditate on this, and separate ourselves as far as possible from the body, that is to say, let us accustom ourselves to die. This will be enjoying a life like that of heaven, even while we remain on earth; and when we are carried thither and released from these bonds, our souls will make their progress with more rapidity; for the spirit which has always been fettered by the bonds of the body, even when it is disengaged, advances more slowly, just as those do who have worn actual fetters for many years. But when we have arrived at this emancipation from the bonds of the body, then indeed we shall begin to live; for this present life is really death, which I could say a good deal in lamentation for, if I chose. A. You have lamented it sufficiently in your book on Consolation; and when I read that, there is nothing which I desire more than to leave these things; but that desire is increased a great deal by what I have just heard. M. The time will come, and that soon, and with equal certainty, whether you hang back or press forward; for time flies. But death is so far from being an evil, as it lately appeared to you, that I am inclined to suspect, not that there is no other thing which is an evil to man, but rather that there is nothing else which is a real good to him; if at least it is true that we become thereby either Gods ourselves, or companions of the Gods. However, this is not of so much consequence, as there are some of us here who will not allow this; but I will not leave off discussing this point till I have convinced you that death can, upon no consideration whatever, be an evil. A. How can it, after what I now know? M. Do you ask how it can? There are crowds of arguers who contradict this, and those not only Epicureans, whom I regard very little, but somehow or other almost every man of letters; and above all, my favorite Dicaearchus is very strenuous in opposing the immortality of the soul; for he has written 3 books, which are entitled Lesbiacs, because the discourse was held at Mytilene, in which he seeks to prove that souls are mortal. The Stoics, on the other hand, allow us a long time for enjoyment, as the life of a raven; they allow the soul to exist a great while, but are against its eternity. XXXII. Are you willing to hear, then, why, even allowing this, death cannot be an evil? A. As you please, but no one shall drive me from my belief in mortality. M. I commend you, indeed, for that, though we should not be too confident in our belief of anything; for we are frequently disturbed by some subtle conclusion. We give way and change our opinions even in things that are more evident than this; for in this there certainly is some obscurity; therefore, should anything of this kind happen, it is well to be on our guard. A. You are right in that; but I will provide against any accident. M. Have you any objection to our dismissing our friends the Stoics? Those, I mean, who allow that the souls exist after they have left the body, but yet deny that they exist forever. A. We certainly may dismiss the consideration of those men who admit that which is the most difficult point in the whole question, namely, that a soul can exist independently of the body, and yet refuse to grant that which is not only very easy to believe, but which is even the natural consequence of the concession which they have made, that if they can exist for a length of time, they most likely do so forever. M. You take it right; that is the very thing. Shall we give, therefore, any credit to Panetius when he dissents from his master Plato, whom he everywhere calls divine, the wisest, the holiest of men, the Homer of philosophers, and whom he opposes in nothing except this single opinion of the soul's immortality? For he maintains what nobody denies, that everything which has been generated will perish, and that even souls are generated, which he thinks appears from their resemblance to those of the men who begot them; for that likeness is as apparent in the turn of their minds as in their bodies. But he brings another reason, that there is nothing which is sensible of pain which is not also liable to disease; but whatever is liable to disease must be liable to death. The soul is sensible of pain, therefore it is liable to perish. XXXIII. These arguments may be refuted; for they proceed from his not knowing that, while discussing the subject of the immortality of the soul, he is speaking of the intellect, which is free from all turbid motion, but not of those parts of the mind in which those disorders, anger and lust, have their seat, and which he whom he is opposing, when he argues thus, imagines to be distinct and separate from the mind. Now, this resemblance is more remarkable in beasts, whose souls are void of reason; but the likeness in men consists more in the configuration of the bodies, and it is of no little consequence in what bodies the soul is lodged; for there are many things which depend on the body that give an edge to the soul, many which blunt it. Aristotle indeed says that all men of great genius are melancholy, so that I should not have been displeased to have been somewhat duller than I am. He instances many, and, as if it were matter of fact, brings his reasons for it. But if the power of those things that proceed from the body be so great as to influence the mind, for they are the things, whatever they are, that occasion this likeness, still that does not necessarily prove why a similitude of souls should be generated. I say nothing about cases of unlikeness. I wish Panetius could be here; he lived with Africanus. I would inquire of him which of his family the nephew of Africanus's brother was like. Possibly he may in person have resembled his father, but in his manners he was so like every profligate, abandoned man, that it was impossible to be more so. Whom did the grandson of Publius Crassus, that wise and eloquent and most distinguished man, resemble? Or the relations and sons of many other excellent men, whose names there is no occasion to mention? But what are we doing? Have we forgotten that our purpose was, when we had sufficiently spoken on the subject of the immortality of the soul, to prove that, even if the soul did perish, there would be, even then, no evil in death? A. I remembered it very well; but I had no dislike to your digressing a little from your original design, while you were talking of the soul's immortality. M. I perceive you have sublime thoughts, and are eager to mount up to heaven. XXXIV. I am not without hopes myself that such may be our fate. But admit what they assert, that the soul does not continue to exist after death. A. Should it be so, I see that we are then deprived of the hopes of a happier life. M. But what is there of evil in that opinion? For let the soul perish as the body, is there any pain, or indeed any feeling at all, in the body after death? No one indeed asserts that, though Epicurus charges Democritus with saying so; but the disciples of Democritus deny it. No sense, therefore, remains in the soul, for the soul is nowhere. Where, then, is the evil? For there is nothing but these two things. Is it because the mere separation of the soul and body cannot be effected without pain? But even should that be granted, how small a pain must that be! Yet I think that it is false, and that it is very often unaccompanied by any sensation at all, and sometimes even attended with pleasure. But certainly the whole must be very trifling, whatever it is, for it is instantaneous. What makes us uneasy, or rather gives us pain, is the leaving all the good things of life. But just consider if I might not more properly say, leaving the evils of life; only there is no reason for my now occupying myself in bewailing the life of man, and yet I might, with very good reason. But what occasion is there, when what I am laboring to prove is that no one is miserable after death, to make life more miserable by lamenting over it? I have done that in the book which I wrote in order to comfort myself as well as I could. If, then, our inquiry is after truth, death withdraws us from evil, not from good. This subject is indeed so copiously handled by Hegesias, the Cyrenaic philosopher, that he is said to have been forbidden by Ptolemy from delivering his lectures in the schools, because some who heard him made away with themselves. There is, too, an epigram of Callimachus on Cleombrotus of Ambracia, who, without any misfortune having befallen him, as he says, threw himself from a wall into the sea, after he had read a book of Plato's. The book I mentioned of that Hegesias is called Apokarteron, or A Man Who Starves Himself, in which a man is represented as killing himself by starvation, till he is prevented by his friends, in reply to whom he reckons up all the miseries of human life. I might do the same, though not so fully as he, who thinks it not worth any man's while to live. I pass over others. Was it even worth my while to live? For had I died before I was deprived of the comforts of my own family, and of the honors which I received for my public services, would not death have taken me from the evils of life rather than from its blessings? XXXV. Mention, therefore, some one who never knew distress, who never received any blow from fortune. The great Metellus had 4 distinguished sons, but Priam had 50, 17 of whom were born to him by his lawful wife. Fortune had the same power over both, though she exercised it but on one; for Metellus was laid on his funeral pile by a great company of sons and daughters, grandsons and granddaughters, but Priam fell by the hand of an enemy, after having fled to the altar, and having seen himself deprived of all his numerous progeny. Had he died before the death of his sons, and the ruin of his kingdom, with all his mighty wealth elate, under rich canopies of state? Would he then have been taken from good or from evil? It would indeed at that time have appeared that he was being taken away from good, yet surely it would have turned out advantageous for him, nor should we have had these mournful verses: Lo, these all perished in one flaming pile! The foe old Priam did of life beguile, And with his blood thy altar, Jove, defile. As if anything better could have happened to him at that time than to lose his life in that manner! But yet, if it had befallen him sooner, it would have prevented all those consequences. But even as it was, it released him from any further sense of them. The case of our friend Pompey was something better. Once, when he had been very ill at Naples, the Neapolitans, on his recovery, put crowns on their heads, as did those of Puteoli. The people flocked from the country to congratulate him. It is a Grecian custom, and a foolish one; still it is a sign of good fortune. But the question is, had he died, would he have been taken from good or from evil? Certainly from evil. He would not have been engaged in a war with his father in law; he would not have taken up arms before he was prepared; he would not have left his own house, nor fled from Italy; he would not, after the loss of his army, have fallen unarmed into the hands of slaves, and been put to death by them; his children would not have been destroyed, nor would his whole fortune have come into the possession of the conquerors. Did not he, then, who, if he had died at that time, would have died in all his glory, owe all the great and terrible misfortunes into which he subsequently fell to the prolongation of his life at that time? XXXVI. These calamities are avoided by death; for, even though they should never happen, there is a possibility that they may; but it never occurs to a man that such a disaster may befall him himself. Every one hopes to be as happy as Metellus, as if the number of the happy exceeded that of the miserable, or as if there were any certainty in human affairs; or again, as if there were more rational foundation for hope than fear. But should we grant them even this, that men are by death deprived of good things, would it follow that the dead are therefore in need of the good things of life, and are miserable on that account. Certainly they must necessarily say so. Can he who does not exist be in need of anything? To be in need of has a melancholy sound, because it in effect amounts to this: he had, but he has not; he regrets, he looks back upon, he wants. Such are, I suppose, the distresses of one who is in need of. Is he deprived of eyes? To be blind is misery. Is he destitute of children? Not to have them is misery. These considerations apply to the living, but the dead are neither in need of the blessings of life, nor of life itself. But when I am speaking of the dead, I am speaking of those who have no existence. But would any one say of us, who do exist, that we want horns or wings? Certainly not. Should it be asked, why not? The answer would be, that not to have what neither custom nor nature has fitted you for would not imply a want of them, even though you were sensible that you had them not. This argument should be pressed over and over again, after that point has once been established, which, if souls are mortal, there can be no dispute about. I mean, that the destruction of them by death is so entire as to remove even the least suspicion of any sense remaining. When, therefore, this point is once well grounded and established, we must correctly define what the term to want means, that there may be no mistake in the word. To want, then, signifies this: to be without that which you would be glad to have; for inclination for a thing is implied in the word want, excepting when we use the word in an entirely different sense, as we do when we say that a fever is wanting to any one; for it admits of a different interpretation when you are without a certain thing, and are sensible that you are without it, but yet can easily dispense with having it. To want, then, is an expression which you cannot apply to the dead; nor is the mere fact of wanting something necessarily lamentable. The proper expression ought to be, that they want a good, and that is an evil. But a living man does not want a good, unless he is distressed without it; and yet we can easily understand how any man alive can be without a kingdom. But this cannot be predicated of you with any accuracy. It might have been asserted of Tarquin, when he was driven from his kingdom; but when such an expression is used respecting the dead, it is absolutely unintelligible. For to want implies to be sensible, but the dead are insensible; therefore the dead can be in no want. XXXVII. But what occasion is there to philosophize here in a matter with which we see that philosophy is but little concerned? How often have not only our generals, but whole armies rushed on certain death? But if it had been a thing to be feared, Lucius Brutus would never have fallen in fight to prevent the return of that tyrant whom he had expelled; nor would Decius, the father, have been slain in fighting with the Latins; nor would his son when engaged with the Etruscans; nor his grandson with Pyrrhus have exposed themselves to the enemy's darts. Spain would never have seen in one campaign the Scipios fall fighting for their country; nor would the plains of Cannae have witnessed the death of Paulus and Geminus, or Venusia that of Marcellus; nor would the Latins have beheld the death of Albinus, nor the Lucanians that of Gracchus. But are any of these miserable now? Nay, they were not so even at the first moment after they had breathed their last. Nor can any one be miserable after he has lost all sensation. Oh, but the mere circumstance of being without sensation is miserable! It might be so, if being without sensation were the same thing as wanting it; but as it is evident there can be nothing of any kind in that which has no existence, what can there be afflicting to that which can neither feel want, nor be sensible of anything? We might be said to have repeated this over too often, only that here lies all that the soul shudders at from the fear of death. For whoever can clearly apprehend that which is as manifest as the light, that when both soul and body are consumed, and there is a total destruction, then that which was an animal becomes nothing, will clearly see that there is no difference between a Hippocentaur, which never had existence, and King Agamemnon, and that Marcus Camillus is no more concerned about this present civil war than I was at the sacking of Rome when he was living. XXXVIII. Why, then, should Camillus be affected with the thoughts of these things happening 350 years after his time? And why should I be uneasy if I were to expect that some nation might possess itself of this city 10,000 years hence? Because so great is our regard for our country, as not to be measured by our own feeling, but by its own actual safety. Death, then, which threatens us daily from 1,000 accidents, and which, by reason of the shortness of life, can never be far off, does not deter a wise man from making such provision for his country and his family as he hopes may last forever, and from regarding posterity, of which he can never have any real perception, as belonging to himself. Wherefore a man may act for eternity, even though he be persuaded that his soul is mortal; not indeed from a desire of glory, which he will be insensible of, but from a principle of virtue, which glory will inevitably attend, though that is not his object. The process indeed of nature is this, that just in the same manner as our birth was the beginning of things with us, so death will be the end; and as we were no ways concerned with anything before we were born, so neither shall we be after we are dead. And in this state of things, where can the evil be, since death has no connection with either the living or the dead? The one have no existence at all, the other are not yet affected by it. They who make the least of death consider it as having a great resemblance to sleep, as if any one would choose to live 90 years on condition that at the expiration of 60 he should sleep out the remainder. The very swine would not accept of life on those terms, much less I. Endymion, indeed, if you listen to fables, slept once on a time on Latmos, a mountain of Caria, and for such a length of time that I imagine he is not as yet awake. Do you think that he is concerned at the moon's being in difficulties, though it was by her that he was thrown into that sleep, in order that she might kiss him while sleeping? For what should he be concerned for who has not even any sensation? You look on sleep as an image of death, and you take that on you daily; and have you, then, any doubt that there is no sensation in death, when you see there is none in sleep, which is its near resemblance? XXXIX. Away, then, with those follies, which are little better than the old women's dreams, such as that it is miserable to die before our time. What time do you mean? That of nature? But she has only lent you life, as she might lend you money, without fixing any certain time for its repayment. Have you any grounds of complaint, then, that she recalls it at her pleasure? For you received it on these terms. They that complain thus allow that if a young child dies, the survivors ought to bear his loss with equanimity; that if an infant in the cradle dies, they ought not even to utter a complaint; and yet nature has been more severe with them in demanding back what she gave. They answer by saying that such have not tasted the sweets of life, while the other had begun to conceive hopes of great happiness, and indeed had begun to realize them. Men judge better in other things, and allow a part to be preferable to none. Why do they not admit the same estimate in life? Though Callimachus does not speak amiss in saying that more tears had flowed from Priam than his son, yet they are thought happier who die after they have reached old age. It would be hard to say why; for I do not apprehend that any one, if a longer life were granted to him, would find it happier. There is nothing more agreeable to a man than prudence, which old age most certainly bestows on a man, though it may strip him of everything else. But what age is long, or what is there at all long to a man? Does not old age, though unregarded, still attend on childhood's pastimes as the cares of men? But because there is nothing beyond old age, we call that long. all these things are said to be long or short, according to the proportion of time they were given us for. Aristotle saith, there is a kind of insect near the river Hypanus, which runs from a certain part of Europe into the Pontus, whose life consists but of one day. Those that die at the eighth hour die in full age; those who die when the sun sets are very old, especially when the days are at the longest. Compare our longest life with eternity, and we shall be found almost as short lived as those little animals. End of Book 1.